The mysterious document. Isabella stepped into Benjamin's room on tiptoes, holding her breath. In the dim light, his silhouette lay still, a rare glimpse of vulnerability in the usually sharp, commanding man she worked for. Tonight, though, something felt different. Papers were scattered on his desk, and a single document lay exposed under the faint glow of the desk lamp. Its bold title seemed to call out to her, and with a trembling hand, Isabella leaned in closer. It was impossible to ignore the swirl of dread and curiosity rising inside her. Benjamin was never one to leave things out of place, especially not in his private quarters. He was methodical, disciplined, almost obsessive about order, and something like this messy, vulnerable scene, could only mean one of two things: a restless night or a slip in his famously guarded composure. She couldn't look away. She had to know. She took one more step and read the title. Last Will and Testament. The words echoed in her mind, setting her heart racing. Isabella's eyes darted back to Benjamin, still sound asleep, completely unaware of the storm he had set off inside her. She knew almost nothing about Benjamin's past. For 2 years, she had worked here, managing his sprawling Miami mansion, watching him live his life of solitude. Not once had she seen a friend or relative visit. In all that time, Benjamin remained a figure of mystery, as closed off as the mansion's grand iron gates. Yet here, in the middle of the night, her name was scrawled below the title in bold, unmistakable letters. Isabella felt her pulse quicken as she took a step back, staring at the document as if it might vanish. Her name in his will. She struggled to make sense of it. How could it be? They shared nothing but a working relationship. Benjamin had always been professional, but distant, maintaining a line that she never dared to cross. Yet, if this document was real, it hinted at something more, something far deeper and more complex than she had ever suspected. Her mind spun as she tried to process the significance. Was this a mistake? Some sort of twisted joke? But there was no one else in the mansion tonight. No one who would play such a prank. She glanced at Benjamin, his face peaceful as he slept, oblivious to the turmoil he'd sparked. No, this document had to mean something. He was too calculated, too precise to make a mistake like this. She could feel the weight of questions she couldn't dare ask him. What would she even say? Benjamin, I happened to stumble across your will in the middle of the night. No, that was impossible. There was no way she could confront him without exposing herself. Yet the thought of leaving this unanswered haunted her. Why would he even think to include her? She was just a housekeeper. To him, she was a fixture of the estate, nothing more. But the longer she stood there, the more unsettling it became. Was there some plan he hadn't told her about? Or could this be a final parting gift, some act of generosity he hadn't intended her to find until much later? The questions weighed on her like stones, each one tugging her deeper into the realization that she didn't know him. Not really. Yet there it was, her name, written in ink, in what was supposed to be his most private document. A quiet unease took root as she glanced around the darkened room, suddenly feeling as though the walls themselves held secrets. Who was Benjamin really? How much had he kept hidden from her, from everyone? In that single moment, Isabella knew she was caught at a crossroads. The life she thought she understood had cracked open, spilling a mystery she was far from prepared to solve. Isabella sat alone in the dim glow of the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. But the warmth didn't reach her. The words from that document kept pulsing in her mind, dredging up a torrent of memories she thought she'd buried long ago. She wasn't even sure how she'd come to work here in Benjamin's Miami mansion in the first place. Maybe it was fate, or maybe she'd just been running from her past for so long that any job would have been enough. But deep down, she knew the answer was much more complicated. Years ago, she'd lived a different life, one of hardships, filled with struggles she'd fought tooth and nail to escape. Raised in a neighborhood where opportunity rarely knocked, Isabella had always carried a fierce independence. She'd built a life on her own terms, far away from the childhood home that had only given her painful memories. But coming here, she'd hoped for more than just stability. She wanted peace, a fresh start. Working for Benjamin had given her that, an escape from her past, a place where she could finally breathe. Yet here she was, her name attached to what she couldn't make sense of, threatening to drag her back into the depths of uncertainty. Benjamin, too, was an enigma she could never crack. In the 2 years she'd worked as his housekeeper, she'd seen glimpses of the man behind the wealth and the walls he'd built around himself. He was polite but cold, a man who knew the power of silence and control. There were days when she wondered if he even knew she existed beyond the services she provided. But every now and then, there was a flicker, something human beneath that stoic exterior. She'd catch him staring out the window, lost in thought, his gaze distant and heavy, as if haunted by ghosts no one else could see. Sometimes, his eyes would linger on her just a second longer than expected, and in that tiny moment, Isabella would feel something unfamiliar, a strange connection, like maybe they weren't as different as she once thought. Yet, she dismissed it as just that, a feeling, nothing more. Benjamin had no family, no friends. At least, not that she'd ever seen. He seemed to be a man who thrived in isolation, or at least endured it with quiet resignation. Now, however, that isolation seemed intentional, deliberate, as if he'd chosen her to be here for reasons she could barely fathom. She knew his life was one shrouded in secrets. The occasional, cryptic phone calls he took in his study, the odd visitors who arrived late at night, only to leave within minutes, all hinted at a world Isabella was never meant to be part of. But now it felt as though she'd been drawn into his life's carefully hidden cracks. The house, too, had its own mysteries. The mansion was sprawling, a maze of opulent rooms and corridors that echoed with the sounds of lives long past. Sometimes, Isabella would walk down a hallway and feel the weight of its history pressing in on her, like she was trespassing in a space not meant for her. She'd heard rumors from the other staff, the gardeners and the chef, whispers that Benjamin's family had once been prominent in the city, but had faded into obscurity, leaving only him as the last living heir to an immense, lonely fortune. But Benjamin never spoke of his family, and Isabella had learned not to ask. Yet, despite his wealth, the house lacked warmth. It was decorated with an elegant coldness, marble floors, intricate chandeliers, and walls lined with dark, imposing art. It was as if Benjamin had wanted to keep everyone, even the very walls, at a distance. She had to wonder now, did he intend for her to find that will? Or had it been a genuine oversight, a rare lapse in his precise, meticulous ways? As she sat there in the dark kitchen, the questions multiplied, each one tugging at the edges of her mind. What did he expect from her? Why was she even in his will at all? The very idea felt absurd. To him, she was just an employee, yet the document suggested otherwise. She tried to shake off the gnawing feeling that this was the start of something much bigger than either of them could control. Tomorrow, she'd have to see him again, act as if nothing had happened, as if she didn't know about the will, about her name tied to his fortune. But how? How could she face him, now aware that their lives were bound in ways she couldn't yet comprehend? The thought of confronting him about it sent a chill through her, and the idea of staying silent gnawed at her even more. Either way, the weight of that document and the secrets it held would change everything. Benjamin, lying just down the hall, seemed even more of a stranger now. Who was he really? What was his purpose in drawing her into his world? And what was he hiding behind those walls of silence? For the first time, Isabella feared she was no longer simply a housekeeper. She was part of a story she hadn't asked to be in, one with secrets buried so deeply they might just swallow her whole. The morning light spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the grand hallways of Benjamin's mansion as Isabella went about her usual tasks. But Nothing about this day felt usual. The memory of the document and her name inked on it gnawed at her, making each step feel like a walk through quicksand. She had barely slept, her mind racing with endless questions and possibilities. The truth was, she couldn't avoid Benjamin forever, and the thought of confronting him about the will made her feel as if she were about to betray some unspoken rule. Yet as much as she wanted to pretend she'd seen nothing, a part of her yearned for answers. For 2 years, she had lived in the shadows of his life, always on the periphery, loyal to her duties but distant from the man who employed her. She had never crossed the line, never dared to ask questions. And maybe that's what kept Benjamin's trust. But now, that trust felt like a delicate thread, one that could unravel with the slightest pull. How could she face him, knowing what she knew? As the morning wore on, Isabella's anxiety built, every step toward the study feeling heavier than the last. She'd gone over every possible scenario in her head. She could confront him, risk losing everything but gain the answer she desperately wanted. Or she could remain silent, bury the discovery deep down, and pretend she'd never seen the document at all. But could she live with herself if she did? Finally, after hours of indecision, she found herself outside Benjamin's study, clutching a feathered duster with white-knuckled tension. Her heart thundered as she raised her hand to knock, but before she could, the door swung open. Benjamin stood there, impeccably dressed, his eyes sharp as ever, and for a moment, they locked gazes. Did he know? Could he sense the turmoil inside her? "Isabella," he said, his voice low and even. "Come in. I've been meaning to talk to you." The words sent a chill down her spine. Had he discovered her secret? Did he know she had seen the will? She stepped inside the study, gripping the duster like a lifeline. The study was as intimidating as ever, its walls lined with bookshelves holding heavy tomes, old leather-bound volumes that seemed to guard secrets she was never meant to understand. "Please sit." Benjamin gestured to a chair across from his desk. She hesitated but complied, sitting across from him, feeling the weight of his gaze settle on her. He watched her in silence for a moment, as if measuring her, and it took every ounce of strength she had to keep her composure. "I know you've been here for some time now," he began slowly, his voice laced with a tone she couldn't quite decipher. "And in that time, I realize I've never properly acknowledged your role here. You've been diligent, discreet, and, above all, trustworthy. These aren't qualities I take lightly." Isabella swallowed, her mind racing. Was this leading to a confession? Did he intend to explain the will? "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I take pride in my work here." "I know," he said with a faint smile, though it barely reached his eyes. "Which is why I felt it was time we discuss your future." There was a hint, a piece of the puzzle. He knew, or at least suspected something, and was baiting her to respond. But she couldn't afford to slip up. Not yet. She had to wait. Let him reveal what he intended to tell her. "I appreciate that, Mr. Benjamin," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "But I am content with things as they are." For a moment, his expression softened, almost as if he were considering her words. But then his face hardened again, his gaze turning inward as if recalling something deeply personal, perhaps painful. "You may feel that way now," he murmured, "but there are circumstances that may change how you see things." He let the statement hang, heavy with meaning, but before she could press for more, he changed the subject abruptly. "Isabella, have you ever wondered about your family?" he asked, almost casually, though his tone betrayed a deeper intent. The question caught her off guard. Her family? She hadn't thought of them in years, had spent most of her life trying to forget the difficult parts. The memories were raw, layered with abandonment, loss, and a childhood she'd been all too eager to leave behind. Why would he bring that up now, of all times? "My family is not something I dwell on," she replied carefully, her defenses rising. Benjamin nodded, almost as if he'd expected her answer. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "the past is a way of catching up to us, whether we're ready for it or not." She wasn't sure if his words were meant for her or himself, but they lingered in the air, filling the silence with a tension that was almost unbearable. In that moment, Isabella realized that he, too, carried a weight, a burden that went beyond wealth or power. Perhaps it was his own past, as hidden and complex as hers. But before she could gather the courage to ask what he meant, he stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "That will be all for now, Isabella," he said, his tone returning to its usual control formality. "Thank you for your time." Dismissed. She rose and left, her heart pounding as she walked back down the hallway. Every step echoed with a growing realization. This was far from over. Benjamin's words had given her more questions than answers, and his veiled remarks had only deepened the mystery. For the first time, she sensed that whatever was happening here, whatever reason he had for including her in his will, it went beyond a simple bequest. There was a story she had yet to uncover, a link between them that reached back further than she could fathom. As she stepped into the sunlight streaming through the mansion's grand foyer, Isabella knew one thing for sure. Her life had irrevocably changed, and with each passing moment, the walls around Benjamin's secrets were starting to crack, drawing her deeper into a truth she was both terrified and compelled to uncover. The following days passed in a haze, each one heightening Isabella's sense of unease. Benjamin's cryptic words had stirred something inside her, unraveling a layer of her usual calm. What had he meant about the past catching up to them? And why did he suddenly care about her family? Unable to ignore the questions, she began to move through the mansion with a heightened sense of purpose, hoping that somewhere within its walls lay the answers she needed. The house felt different now, as if every room held clues she'd been too blind to notice before. One afternoon, as she dusted the bookshelves in the study, her fingers brushed over a particular book that looked more worn than the others, a leather-bound volume, tucked away in a corner. She pulled it out, revealing a hidden compartment behind the shelf. Inside was a stack of old photographs, yellowed at the edges, as if untouched for years. She hesitated, a chill running through her as she reached for the photos. In the first picture, she recognized a young Benjamin standing beside a couple, their arms draped around him with familiarity. They looked like a family, a stark contrast to the solitary man she knew now. The woman wore a delicate pendant, and Benjamin, not more than 10 years old, held a shy smile. Isabella's gaze dropped to the next photograph and froze. Her hands began to shake as she stared down at a familiar face. Her own mother, much younger but unmistakable, standing alongside the same couple from the previous photo. In the picture, her mother was laughing, her hand resting on Benjamin's shoulder as if she'd known him well. A rush of memories surfaced, memories she hadn't touched in years. She'd heard stories growing up, vague mentions of a family friend who'd moved away, but her mother had never shared details. And Isabella had never thought to ask. Now, seeing these photos, it felt as though her life was suddenly connected to Benjamin's in ways she couldn't explain. She placed the photographs back carefully, her mind racing. Why had her mother never told her about Benjamin? And what had happened between them that left him alone, isolated in the sprawling mansion? Just then, she heard footsteps approaching and hurriedly returned the book to its place. As she turned, Benjamin entered the study, and for a split second their eyes met, and she wondered if he could see the questions burning behind her gaze. "Isabella," he said quietly, his usual composure tinged with something softer, something that almost seemed like regret. "Yes, sir." She forced herself to remain steady, her pulse hammering with the knowledge she'd just uncovered. He paused, his expression unreadable. "There's something I want to share with you, a part of my life that may be difficult to understand." His voice was softer than usual, the words carrying a weight she hadn't heard from him before. She nodded, sensing that this was the moment she'd been waiting for. Maybe he'd finally reveal the reason her name was in his will, or why he seemed so invested in her family. He gestured toward the window, looking out over the vast estate with a distant expression. "Years ago, your mother and I were close. She was like family to me," he said, his voice laced with a sorrow that seemed to reach far into his past. "When she left, I lost one of the last connections I had to anything that felt like home." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She'd never expected him to speak of her mother, let alone with such affection. The hardened man she knew, who lived with walls so high no one dared to breach them, was revealing a piece of himself that felt deeply vulnerable. "She was part of a time in my life I've tried to bury, yet somehow, your presence here brings it all back," he continued, glancing at her with an intensity that made her look away. "When I found out you were her daughter, I knew I had to keep you close, to protect you in a way I couldn't protect her." Isabella felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of her was touched, hearing that he had known and cared for her mother. But another part of her couldn't ignore the question still pressing on her mind. "Why don't you ever tell me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Benjamin sighed, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I thought it would be easier if you didn't know. But as time went on, I realized that you deserve to understand your connection to this place. Your mother was special to me. In many ways, she saved me from myself." Isabella's chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. The mansion, the wealth, the solitude, all of it suddenly made sense in a way she'd never expected. She understood now why he'd left her in his will. He wasn't just leaving her a piece of his fortune. He was trying to pass on a legacy, a connection to a past that had shaped both of their lives. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Part of her felt an unexpected relief, while another part felt the sorrow of a history she never truly understood. Benjamin gave a small, sad smile. "There's nothing you need to say. Just know that I wanted you here for a reason, that you're not alone in this world, even if it may feel like it sometimes." As the words settled between them, a silence filled the room. The mansion, once a place of mystery and isolation, felt strangely different now, a place woven with shared memories and unspoken bonds. But Isabella knew there was more to this story, something still hidden beneath the surface. The photographs, the memories, her name on the will. These pieces fit together, yet they left shadows she couldn't fully unravel. She sensed that whatever connected her and Benjamin went beyond mere family ties, beyond simple affection. Before she left the study, Isabella glanced back at him one last time, seeing a man burdened by both grief and guilt. She realized that his wealth, his solitary life, was less a choice and more a consequence of a past he could never let go. As she walked back through the mansion's echoing halls, she knew that her search for answers was far from over. If anything, Benjamin's revelation had only deepened the mystery. The revelation of her mother's connection to Benjamin haunted Isabella in the days that followed. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much left unsaid, hidden behind the mansion's cold walls and Benjamin's carefully guarded demeanor. If her mother had been so important to him, why had he never reached out to their family before? Why now? And what was it about her mother's departure that seemed to have scarred him so deeply? These questions followed her through every room she cleaned, every hallway she crossed. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Isabella decided to seek answers on her own terms. She began to search the house systematically, hoping to uncover more pieces of this hidden history. Each room held its own secrets, each corridor echoing with the life of a family long gone. But the mansion was vast, and she felt as if she were barely scratching the surface. One evening, as she was cleaning the attic, an area she rarely entered, a small chest caught her eye. Covered in dust and tucked beneath an old tapestry, the chest seemed as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Isabella's heart pounded as she knelt before it, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of old documents, letters, and a single photograph that made her breath catch. The photograph was of her mother and Benjamin, standing close together, not as friends, but as something more. The look in her mother's eyes, the way Benjamin's hand rested gently on her shoulder, it told a story of connection, of familiarity that went far beyond what Benjamin had described. But it was the letters beneath the photograph that truly shattered her understanding. dozens of them, neatly folded and addressed in her mother's handwriting. She picked one up, her fingers tracing the faded ink, and began to read. "Dearest Benjamin," the letter began, "I hope you find peace after all of this. I've made the hardest decision of my life, and I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. But please understand that I did this for us. There are things I can't let you carry with you. I can't let my past become your burden." Isabella's hands shook as she read, the words unraveling a story of heartbreak and sacrifice. Her mother had left Benjamin not because she wanted to, but because of something darker, something that had forced her to sever ties. And yet, through each letter, Isabella could feel the weight of her mother's love, a love that lingered even after their lives had diverged. As she read on, Isabella realized that her mother had left behind secrets of her own, secrets she'd never intended Isabella to discover. One letter mentioned a fortune, something Benjamin had inherited but had been reluctant to accept. Another spoke of promises, of a legacy tainted by deceit and loss. There were references to family debts, to an inheritance her mother had wanted to protect from whatever shadows had haunted Benjamin's family. It wasn't just her mother's story she was discovering. These letters hinted at a hidden legacy that connected her family to Benjamin's in ways Isabella had never imagined. They spoke of a joint business venture, a failed partnership that had drained both families financially. Her mother had been deeply involved, though Isabella had no idea to what extent. The letters suggested that her mother's departure had been an attempt to shield Benjamin from the fallout, a selfless act meant to preserve whatever remained of his inheritance. Suddenly, Benjamin's insistence on keeping her close, his cryptic remarks, even her inclusion in the will, they all made sense. She was here to inherit the remnants of a promise made years ago, a legacy her mother had tried to protect but had ultimately left in Benjamin's hands. The mansion, the wealth, all of it was tainted by the ghost of that broken partnership, a debt that neither family had truly escaped. Isabella sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. She'd spent her life trying to escape the struggles of her upbringing, only to find herself pulled back into a history she hadn't even known existed. Her mother had carried these secrets to the grave, leaving Isabella to uncover the truth alone. And Benjamin, he'd known all along. A surge of anger rose within her. Why hadn't he told her? Why had he let her stumble through this maze of half-truths and buried memories? She felt a burning need to confront him, to demand answers for the years of silence, the years he let her mother's memory remain buried beneath layers of guilt and secrecy. Gathering the letters and the photograph, Isabella made her way to Benjamin's study. She found him there, seated in his leather chair, lost in thought. The moment she entered, he looked up, and she saw a flicker of recognition and resignation in his eyes. "I found him," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. She held up the letters, watching as his face tightened. He didn't deny it, didn't try to explain. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze heavy with the weight of an entire lifetime of regret. "I always knew you would. Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "Why did you let me think my mother's connection to you was just friendship?" Benjamin sighed, his expression softening. "Because some stories are too painful to relive, Isabella. Your mother loved you enough to leave, to protect you from the mistakes of the past. She wanted a better life for you, a life untainted by the burden of this legacy. She thought that if I kept you here, close, I could give you that life without the pain that came with it. But that wasn't your choice to make," Isabella whispered, feeling the sting of betrayal. "I had a right to know." Benjamin looked down, his shoulders heavy with the weight of her accusation. "You're right. I should have told you. But I was afraid that if you knew you'd leave, just as she did. And I couldn't bear that. Not again." In that moment, Isabella saw Benjamin not as a powerful, untouchable figure, but as a man haunted by his own mistakes, his own failures. He had spent years living in a prison of his own making, bound by the choices he'd made and the love he'd lost. She felt a pang of empathy, though it did little to ease her anger. She took a deep breath, trying to process the flood of emotions. She knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, that uncovering the truth was only the beginning. She had inherited more than just a fortune. She had inherited a legacy of broken promises, of love sacrificed and lives forever changed. And as she stood there, watching the man who had shaped her life from the shadows, she knew that her path was now irrevocably intertwined with his. She would have to confront not only his past but her own, to forge a future free from the ghosts that haunted both of them. In that moment, Isabella made a silent promise to herself. She would honor her mother's memory, but she would do it on her own terms, determined to carve out her own destiny from the tangled history that had brought her to this place. Isabella felt the weight of her mother's letters deep within her soul. The dusty attic, the forgotten chest, the letters filled with secrets and sorrow. All of it had shifted her understanding of her mother, Benjamin, and, most painfully, herself. She carried this weight down from the attic and through the mansion, her thoughts as tangled as the winding halls of Benjamin's grand home. Days passed, but the burden of what she learned lingered, transforming her daily routine into an emotionally charged balancing act. Each time she crossed paths with Benjamin, an unspoken tension filled the air. He seemed to sense it, too, often catching her eye with an expression that almost asked for forgiveness. But Isabella didn't know if she was ready to forgive him, or if she ever would be. One afternoon, a week after discovering the letters, Isabella found herself standing before the closed door to Benjamin's private wing. She knew he was inside, probably lost in his own thoughts, but for the first time, she felt an overwhelming need to confront him, not with anger, but with understanding. If she was going to move forward, if she was going to break free of the shadows that clung to her family's name, she needed to hear the truth from him directly. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Isabella knocked. After a brief silence, Benjamin's voice, tired yet familiar, called for her to enter. She stepped inside, and there he was, seated by the fire, looking as weary as she'd ever seen him. The once imposing figure seemed to have withered, as if the secrets of the past had drained him over time. She could see the toll his choices had taken on him, on his spirit, and in that moment she felt the first pangs of sympathy start to soften her heart. "Isabella," he said softly, his gaze lifting to meet hers. There was a heaviness in his voice as though he, too, had been waiting for this conversation. "I thought you might come." "Benjamin," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "I want to understand everything. No more half-truths or hidden memories. I need to know why my mother left you and why you think I should stay." Benjamin sighed, his gaze returning to the flames dancing in the fireplace. "I owe you that much," he said quietly. He motioned to the chair across from him, and Isabella sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Your mother and I," he began, pausing as if struggling to find the right words. "We were very much in love, but our love was complicated, tainted by family obligations and choices that were not ours to make. We were young, foolishly thinking that we could overcome anything." He looked away, his expression distant, as though he were staring into a time long past. "My family wasn't kind to her. They saw her as a threat to the legacy, a reminder that I had strayed from the path they had planned for me. I was expected to uphold the family name, to marry within a certain circle, and to maintain the family's fortune without the emotional distractions that love brings." Isabella's heart clenched. She could see now how her mother must have felt, how deeply she must have loved Benjamin to risk everything. And yet, she also understood why her mother had ultimately chosen to leave. The weight of that decision, the pain of walking away from the man she loved, must have been unbearable. "But why include me in your life now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "After all these years, why bring me here, only to keep me in the dark?" Benjamin leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. "Because, Isabella, you are the last piece of her that I have. When I learned who you were, that you were her daughter, it was as if a part of her had returned to me. And I wanted to protect you, to give you the life she would have wanted for you. But don't you see?" Isabella said, her voice breaking. She wanted me to have a life free of these secrets and legacies and painful choices. She wanted me to be my own person, to make my own decisions. Benjamin looked away, his jaw tight. Perhaps you're right, but I couldn't let go of the past of her. And bringing you here in some twisted way, I thought it would make things right. That by protecting you, I could somehow honor her memory. The weight of his words settled heavily between them, filling the room with an air of regret. Isabella felt a pang of sadness for him, a man who had spent his life haunted by what he'd lost, by the choices he hadn't been strong enough to make. But at the same time, she felt anger bubbling within her, anger that he had pulled her into this web of unfulfilled promises and unspoken memories. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I think it's time for both of us to let go, she said, her voice soft but resolute. I can't keep living in a shadow of a love that ended years ago, and you can't keep trying to rewrite the past through me. Benjamin's face fell, and for a moment, she thought he might protest, but he only nodded, a look of resignation in his eyes. You're right, Isabella. You're absolutely right. I've spent my life trying to fix things that can't be fixed, holding on to a memory that's long gone. It's time for me to let you live your own life, as she would have wanted. Isabella felt a wave of relief, mingled with sadness. She had come here hoping for answers, for a sense of closure, and while she had found them, the journey had left her feeling raw and exposed. Yet, in some strange way, it also felt liberating, as if she had finally broken free of the chains that had bound her to a past she hadn't chosen. As she stood to leave, Benjamin reached out, his hand trembling as he held hers for a moment. Isabella, he said, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to finally let go. She squeezed his hand, offering him a small, sad smile. Thank you for telling me the truth, she replied softly. It's never too late to move forward, to find peace. With that, she left him sitting by the fire, his silhouette cast in shadow against the flickering flames. As she walked through the mansion's grand hallways one last time, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The weight of her mother's legacy, of Benjamin's unspoken pain, had been lifted, and for the first time, she felt free. Outside, she paused, looking back at the mansion, its walls now holding memories that no longer haunted her. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and walked away, ready to embrace a future unburdened by the shadows of the past. After leaving Benjamin's mansion that day, Isabella felt a strange mixture of freedom and uncertainty. The Grand Miami estate, with its looming shadows and intricate past, had become a second home to her. Yet it was also a place tied to secrets and pain that had not been hers to bear. Now, for the first time, she felt free to move forward, to shape her own path. But that freedom also brought a sense of weightlessness, a feeling of being untethered and alone in a world that suddenly felt too big and unknown. In the days that followed, Isabella returned to her modest apartment in the quieter part of the city. She looked at her belongings with new eyes. The life she'd built, the one she had been so determined to keep separate from her mother's struggles and Benjamin's wealth, now felt small and inadequate in a way it hadn't before. She had spent so many years building walls, protecting herself from a world she thought she understood, only to find herself in the middle of a legacy and a story she hadn't expected. One morning, she found herself walking along Miami Beach, the ocean waves lapping gently at her feet. The sun warmed her face, the salty air filled her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. Her life no longer felt dictated by secrets or controlled by forces she couldn't understand. She was no longer the daughter of a struggling mother, nor the young woman trying to make ends meet. She was just Isabella, a woman ready to step into the unknown. As she watched the waves crash, she thought about her mother and the letters she'd found, each word a testament to a love that had been both beautiful and tragic. The letters had shown her a side of her mother she hadn't known, a woman who had been brave and self-sacrificing, who had loved deeply but had also been haunted by the need to protect her child from the consequences of that love. Isabella felt an ache in her heart, a longing to tell her mother that she understood now, that she forgave her for the choices she had made. But what was her own choice now? She had a connection to Benjamin, a man who, despite his flaws, had shown her kindness and provided her with answers. And she had his offer, an inheritance she hadn't expected, but which could transform her life. Yet, as tempting as it was to accept the wealth and security he offered, Isabella was also wary of becoming entangled in the very life her mother had tried so hard to escape. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Isabella's thoughts kept circling back to the idea of the future. She realized that her life was at a crossroads. She could take the inheritance and stay connected to Benjamin, perhaps even continue as his confidant and companion in some capacity. Or she could step away completely, leave behind the wealth, the mansion, and the complexities of his world, and instead try to carve out a life on her own terms. The decision felt impossible, yet Isabella knew that choosing inaction was, in itself, a choice. She thought back to her mother's letters and remembered a passage that had struck her deeply. Sometimes love means letting go, allowing the people we care about to make their own mistakes, to forge their own path, even if it takes them far from us. Perhaps that was what her mother would have wanted for her. Not a life spent managing an inheritance from a man she barely knew, but a life spent chasing her own dreams, creating her own legacy. The next morning, Isabella made her way to a quiet cafe near the ocean, a place she often visited when she needed to think. She sat down with a notebook, intending to make a pros and cons list. But as she looked at the blank page, her mind wandered instead to what her life could look like if she let go of everything that had happened with Benjamin. She imagined herself living in a small, sunlit home, surrounded by books and art, maybe even starting her own business, something she had always dreamed of but had never dared to pursue. The idea took root in her mind, growing steadily stronger. The thought of leaving the past behind, of creating a future that was entirely hers, filled her with a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. She knew that walking away from Benjamin's inheritance would be a hard choice, that she might struggle financially, and that the path ahead would be uncertain. But she also knew that it was the path that felt truest to her heart. That evening, she returned to the mansion one last time, not as an employee or an heir, but as a woman saying goodbye. She found Benjamin in his study as usual and told him her decision. He listened in silence, his face reflecting a mixture of sadness and pride. "I understand, Isabella," he said finally, his voice gentle. "I hoped you would choose this path. Your mother would be proud." She smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude for him, for everything he had done, for the answers he had given her, and for the freedom he was now allowing her. "Thank you, Benjamin," she said, her voice soft. "For everything." They shared a moment of quiet understanding, the kind that only comes from shared pain and shared healing. As Isabella turned to leave, she felt a sense of closure, of peace with the choices her mother had made, and with the decision she was now making for herself. The mansion and everything it represented were no longer weights around her heart, but memories that she could carry forward without regret. Isabella left the mansion for the last time, feeling both lighter and stronger. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, that she would face difficulties and uncertainties without the cushion of wealth or status. But she also knew that her future was hers alone, unbound by the shadows of her past. The lessons she had learned, the love and sacrifices of her mother, and the wisdom she had gained from Benjamin would guide her as she stepped into this new life. Standing on the street outside, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift with each exhale. Isabella knew she was finally free, not just from her mother's legacy or Benjamin's wealth, but from the fear of following her own path. And as she walked away from the mansion, she felt a sense of anticipation, a spark of hope for the life that lay ahead. Isabella's new life started slowly, in the way that most genuine beginnings do. Each day felt like an adventure, both exhilarating and terrifying, as she moved through unfamiliar routines, learned new things about herself, and took small, determined steps toward building a life of her own. Her days were filled with simplicity, but also with a sense of purpose she had never known. For the first time, every decision, every action felt entirely hers. With her inheritance left behind, Isabella had to be careful with money, but this too felt empowering. She found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood far from Benjamin's mansion and began pursuing something she had always dreamed of, opening a small business of her own. Inspired by her mother's love of stories and the hidden letters that had changed her life, Isabella decided to open a bookstore and cafe, a place where people could connect with stories and each other. It would be a haven for people looking for comfort and inspiration, much like the sense of peace she had found in her mother's letters. The first few months were difficult, as she navigated the challenges of setting up a business on a shoestring budget. There were late nights spent painting walls, early mornings spent arranging bookshelves, and countless hours dedicated to paperwork and logistics. But Isabella felt alive, driven by a purpose that was deeply personal. Each task, each hurdle overcome, brought her closer to the vision she had carried in her heart. The bookstore quickly became her sanctuary, filled with the smell of fresh coffee, the soft hum of quiet conversations, and shelves lined with stories from all over the world. It became a gathering place for people from all walks of life. Isabella found joy in watching people lose themselves in books, seeing the way a story could bring comfort or inspiration to someone's day. It was a reminder of her mother's spirit, of the love for storytelling and connection that she had passed down. One evening, months after she'd last seen him, Benjamin came to visit the bookstore. Isabella was surprised, but also touched by his presence. He looked around the cozy space, his expression softening as he took in the worn armchairs, the eclectic mix of books, and the comforting scent of coffee in the air. "You've created something truly beautiful here, Isabella," he said, his voice warm. "Your mother would be proud." Isabella felt a lump in her throat, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Benjamin," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "This place, it's my way of honoring her. And myself, too." They shared a quiet moment, both of them understanding what the bookstore represented, a new beginning, free of the weight of the past. Isabella knew she would always feel a connection to Benjamin, but it was a connection born of respect and healing, not of obligation or dependence. In a way, he had become like family to her, a reminder of the history she carried but no longer felt defined by. As the weeks turned into months, Isabella continued to build her life, one small step at a time. The bookstore grew in popularity, and she found herself surrounded by people who believed in her vision, who supported her dream. She formed friendships, found joy in the little things, and discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't known she possessed. Her life was far from perfect, but it was real, and it was hers. One day, while sorting through a new shipment of books, Isabella found an old, worn copy of a novel she remembered her mother reading to her as a child. She opened the cover, her fingers brushing against the yellowed pages, and felt a wave of nostalgia and love wash over her. She knew in that moment that her mother's legacy was not in the secrets or the wealth she had walked away from, but in the spirit of resilience, kindness, and passion that had always guided her. Isabella had finally found her place in the world, and though it wasn't a life of luxury or status she had been offered, it was a life she had chosen, a life rooted in love, honesty, and freedom. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt fully equipped to face them, empowered by her journey and ready to embrace whatever came next. And as she closed the book and looked around her little bookstore, Isabella smiled, feeling a sense of peace that went beyond words. She had come full circle, finding not just her place in the world, but also a profound sense of self. In her heart, she knew that her mother's love and Benjamin's support had helped her reach this place, but it was her own courage that had led her here. Isabella had created a life she could call her own, and in doing so, she had finally laid the ghosts of the past to rest. The future stretched out before her, filled with possibilities and unknowns, but she faced it with an open heart, knowing that she was ready for whatever it might bring.